Welcome, Elisha Daeva, to the Museum of Woman interview.
Thank you so much.
Elisha, your amazing book, Before War, on marriage, hierarchy, and our matriarchal origins, you published this in 2023, is that correct?
That's right.
To great acclaim. And you worked on it for how long?
25 years. Yeah,
25 years. So this is really your life's work to this point. Is that fair to say?
definitely. It's
Yeah.
my mission.
The phenomenal Riane Eisler, who we have talked about a lot at the Museum of Woman. Of course, everyone knows her as the author of The Chalice and the Blade, a classic. She said of your book, this is an important contribution to bringing the evidence of our true human history out. Robert Forte, who's the author of Entheogens and the Future of Religion, he said, I thought this was funny. He said, your book should come with a warning. He said that reading it, you find yourself intellectually naked, examining the savage origins of patriarchy. And he asks, are you ready to let go of cultural programming deep in your genes? Are you ready to broaden your perspective on yourself and on society? Are you ready for this rich tapestry of information? And Stephen Dinan, the CEO of the Shift Network, says a trailblazing, paradigm shaking book, and it gives us a riveting and revelatory read. And then finally, Lee Warren, a death doula, says, for me, Elisha Daeva's book helped me pick up right where I left off with Gimbutas and Eisler, defining patriarchy, the history of Western civilization, where Europeans come from, zoology, sexology, linguistics, genetics, archaeology, history, and mythology, building a solid foundation and a clear, reasonable, and captivating understanding of how our historians have been misinterpreting the data that's been uncovered over the last several hundred years, and how that misinterpretation of our origins has held in place a violent, unequal, and destructive social order that's serving a very small percentage of humans and screwing the rest of us. The depth of information the author has curated over the course of more than 20 years is nothing short of staggering, and none of it funded by moneyed interests. She provides updates to Gimbuta's findings and paints a picture that may liberate us all from this pathological tyranny that is patriarchy. To be reminded of our egalitarian, woman-loving, land-honoring past is a tremendous contribution to my life personally. I have spent my entire life, she says, trying to be in a body that does not seem to belong to me. And so many women feel that. My value seems to be based on how well I pass the test of perfection and how much I'm willing to serve the values of the machine of conformity. And finally, she says, it's time to end this demonic and misguided and failed experiment that is patriarchy and get back or forward to the societies we all long for: fair, equal, kind, loving, and prosperous for all. She finishes up, thank you, Elisha Daeva, for reminding us of our past and shining a light towards our future. Well, praise can't get much better than that. Your book truly is an amazing new contribution to our understanding of humanity, our past, and how we all got here as human beings. Elisha, what compelled you to write the book? Was there a single moment in your life when you just knew, when you said to yourself, I have to get this information down on paper. I simply must write this book?
So my whole life, there was a sense in which something was wrong with the world. It seemed like things just didn't add up. They just weren't right. Like, why were innocent people being killed when governments had disagreements? Like, why was I, who was as intelligent as my male relatives, expected to clean up after dinner instead of participating in the conversations? Why was the planet being destroyed by oil tankers and loggers? Why did girls have such bad sex, and why were boys so mean to girls? All of these things were just stuck in my mind as like, I don't get it. Like something's not right about the world. And then when I was 22, in 1992, I read Rian Eisler's book, The Chalice and the Blade. It changed my life because it made me realize this isn't normal. This isn't the human species. We're not doomed as a species. This is an institutional detour from our default nature, which is a nature of peace and egalitarianism. And we're on a track of destruction, and we're on the brink of destruction from this society ideology. And the most important thing we can do in our lives is to understand these dynamics and heal from them before we destroy the planet. So I just started collecting information because it became my special interest. Eventually it made its way into a book.
Other books have been written on matriarchies, on marriage, on hierarchies, on the rise of patriarchy. Can you share just one or two examples of what you felt needed to be added to this conversation that was your particular important contribution?
There was a golden era in the 90s when after The Chalice and the Blade, and then other books came out like Merlin Stone's books. And so that was the sort of era of the goddess. And since then, there was an event, which we can talk about later, that shut this whole conversation down. And it's essentially been not talked about since then. And so not a whole lot of other information has come out. And so I wanted to address some of that. So it's essentially a sequel to The Chalice and the Blade that picks off where that left off with all of the new information that's come out in the last 30 years. And one of the biggest pieces is the genetic information. Just since 2017, we've had new methods of doing genetic analysis of ancient skeletons that we weren't previously able to do. And that's given us an enormous amount of information that has vindicated Maria Gimbutas's theories of the rise of patriarchy and the matrilineal peaceful cultures that preceded them. So I include that genetic evidence. And then nobody has talked about the linguistics evidence for the fact that tyranny and male dominance and war and oppressive leadership are relatively new concepts, because in linguistics, when there's a word that's new or when it's come from another culture, that tells us that concept didn't exist in the language previously. It needed to be borrowed from another culture or invented. And so looking at the linguistics data is something that nobody else has really done to show how people lived before patriarchy and then what changed. And actually the piece that I'm the most proud of, because it's really the most personal, that my own theories, almost everything else is really a collection of all the data that was out there. So I'm an interdisciplinary thinker, and I'm just taking all the different academic disciplines, and there's 7,000 academic citations. So I'm really just collecting everybody else's work. But my work on the linguistics of colonization and how all of our languages are a result of a colonizer language being imposed upon a much larger substrate. They call it a substrate because the colonizers were few and the colonized were many, and how that created a mishmash of two very different languages, and how colonizer languages, Indo-European and Semitic, have very particular characteristics that affect the way we think. So those are two things that haven't really been brought into the discussion. And then another piece is the animal information that hasn't really been collected together. So no one else was really putting in the primate information. So those are some sort of unique pieces that all got collected in my book.
And thank you for your own work and your own addition to the knowledge, the true history. And thank you for collecting other people's research. Just to have it all in one place is such such a fantastic thing. Nobody's going to do the research that you did to go track this stuff down. And just to be able to have it in one fantastic book. You mentioned that this all stopped, this discussion stopped sometime in the 90s. Can you say more about that? Why? What stopped it? What happened?
One of the kind of side missions of the book, because it's very related and important to understand, is the way that politics affects what we can talk about in academia and in the public conversation at large. And that, in fact, academic truth isn't really driving truth. In fact, politics is driving academic truth. And so I give a lot of examples of how the so-called prehistoric matriarchy was discovered in the early days of anthropology by the likes of Karl Marx and his contemporaries. Everyone agreed that there was an earlier stage in which all cultures had matrilineal inheritance and a central importance of women, and that there was, as Engels called it, the historic defeat of the female sex. So that was generally agreed upon until one man got really threatened by that and basically shut down the whole conversation by insisting that male dominance goes back to apes, and and so does marriage, and even apes get married, and all kinds of nonsense like that, because he wanted it to be true because of his religious beliefs. That was in the 50s that got shut down. And then in the 90s, so Maria Gimbutas was the archaeologist and anthropologist whose 50 years of archaeological digs combined with her other degrees in religious studies, and she was a true interdisciplinary thinker who could read in like 18 different languages. So she was able to put together all of this into painting a picture of the egalitarian society that preceded patriarchy and that basically invented civilization. She had a rivalry going, the most contentious debate that ever happened in academia about the origins of Indo-European people, which most of us have Indo-European lineage, speak Indo-European languages. So there was this debate for 200 years about where Indo-Europeans came from. And she believed they came from the Russian steppes, and they were an intrusive force into Western Europe, and that they weren't the inventors of agriculture and civilization. But her rival, who was Sir Colin Renfrew, kind of an old blue-blooded lord who had a lot of money and a lot of influence over both archaeology and anthropology, he had a rival theory that actually the Indo-Europeans were the originators of civilization, and that Indo-European languages began in Turkey and spread from there. And he was motivated to discredit her. And because of his power within the academic establishments and his great wealth and his power over who got to publish in the journals, he was able to basically discredit her just by making some misogynistic remarks, which unfortunately in academia, all it takes is an influential person to make some misogynistic remarks, and then everybody kind of follows suit and wants to distance themselves from the person. So not a single person to this day has ever been able to argue with any of her points, ever. She's never been discredited through actually showing that she was wrong. She was just made a laughingstock. They made cracks about how she was obsessed with fertility goddesses because she was going through menopause and that kind of nonsense. And so, to his credit,
and she was vindicated a few years ago. There was a little flurry of information that said, "Oh, I guess she was right after all."
Sir Colin Renfrew, her rival, did, to his credit, say she was magnificently vindicated by the DNA evidence. But that was long after her death. And so that whole thing basically shut down the conversation and made it not something that anybody wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole.
Talking about Maria Gimbutas' theories, information, and research, what do you think was the reason the Kurgans coming down from the steppes, why did they develop so differently from the rest of Europe?
The truth is that nobody knows for sure. But what the evidence points to is that the recipe for patriarchy is extended, prolonged trauma combined with limited resources that are easily hoardable and controllable into a few hands. So it seemed that there was this rapid desertification event in around the fourth millennia BCE, where an entire swath of land from North Africa into Central Asia turned to desert very rapidly. And that would have created extreme trauma. And in times of trauma, even for apes, humans stop prioritizing affection, sex, sexual bonding, family bonding, and basically get tune out. It's a trauma response. And then the theory is that there was a response to turn to strong male leaders in times of trauma, and that male leaders would have begun to transition the community away from hunting and gathering to pastoralism. So pastoralism, which is having animals and cows instead of farming or hunter gathering, is one of the conditions of patriarchy, because with cows, it's easy for one man to control all the cows, and then no one else eats if they don't do what he says. And that creates a situation where he's hoarding the herds, and then he wants to pass those herds on to his sons, and that creates this patrilineal inheritance of needing to know who your father is. And once you need to know who your father is, you have to control sexuality, which means you have to control women. And that leads to authoritarianism and psychopathology, because controlling sexuality, you're suppressing a natural urge that's not psychologically healthy. And so that is the theory about how all that happened, because it was the cultures, the Semitic and Indo-European cultures, the Kurgans, and that transcends race or ethnicity. It was really about these Central Asian cultures that were the ones adjacent to the deserts, and they were the ones that developed this culture. Now, whether it was just one incident and it spread from there to the others, or whether it's a recipe for patriarchy that has happened more than once when all these conditions are present, we may never know. But it's kind of like, in my mind, it's the big question that I'm trying to answer. And all of the groups I've seen that have patriarchy that I could find all have signs of clear contact with the steppe nomads, the Kurgans. So that would support the hypothesis that the steppe nomads were the only ones, and everyone else were colonized or contacted by them, except for it's not clear with Papua New Guineans and Native Australians, who appear to have patriarchy from potentially an earlier cycle. It seems possible that these things go in cycles, especially as this desert becomes lush and then dries every 20,000 years. So it's possible that there were earlier cycles of it as well.
Right. And we know there's been all kinds of climate change, the Younger Dryas. There could be repeated incidents of tremendous climatic change over wide swaths of areas that would certainly be the trauma that would result in this patriarchal response of we can't care and love anymore because we got to just scramble for food and survival. Yeah, so the whole tend and befriend thing of woman, it turns into to fight or flight, but mostly fight apparently, huh? Yeah.
Well, a lot of groups did the flight thing. So for thousands of years after the Kurgans started their westward invasions, many groups just fled. So thousands of years later, there's groups up in the mountains and on the islands that were living their old ways, just in places that were far away from the center of things. So the Aegean Islands were a last bastion of the matrilineal civilization, and that flowered into the Minoan civilization, which was the last real gasp of that whole thing. So on the islands and in the mountains, there were some Kurgan-free cultures that lasted a lot longer.
And it shows you how adaptable human beings are and have to be in trying to figure out how to survive. But we can move past that now that we have this understanding. There are some books out there that challenge all this research, the research of other brilliant women like Heidi Gettner Abendroth with her documentation of matriarchal societies in her book, Societies of Peace. I myself have gone to Tibet and met a few members of the Mosuo patriarchal people. Unfortunately, they are now being contaminated by the Chinese government, who is deliberately bringing in a lot of Han Chinese to dilute their ancient culture. But they're trying their best to hang on. The book I'm thinking of is The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory: Why an Invented Past Won't Give Women a Future by Cynthia Eller. What's your response to a title like that?
So one of the things I trace in the book is how there is an enormous cognitive bias for people to support patriarchy. So women support patriarchy and perpetuate it almost as much as men, sometimes more, because women have had to be conditioned in it even more than men are in order to go against our better interests. And women have not been given the same opportunities and the same respect. So what we see is a lot of women who are wanting to be respected in their fields are very careful to distance themselves from anything that's controversial, to distance themselves from anything that's been tarnished with the brush of feminism, of goddess worship, because that's essentially part of how Gimbutas was discredited and the whole thing was shut down, was when her work got popularized by the neo-goddess movement. That really discredited it because spirituality and academics don't mix. And she really had nothing to do with all the sort of bra-burning, goddess-worshipping neo-pagans, but that didn't matter. Just their adoption of her really discredited her. And so women like Cynthia Eller have always had to stump for the patriarchy for their own status and make it sound like they're playing with the boys. And if you actually read her book, there's no coherent arguments for why Gimbutas was wrong. It's just kind of a bunch of nonsense, distraction, all in a way to just put that headline out there and position herself as not one of those feminist archaeologists.
And women saw what was done to Gimbutas and other women who stepped out of line. And when you see what's done to them and you want to try to make your own little life happen in a good way and be prosperous and be respected, well, that is a brutal way of forcing an individual into line. I worked in the corporate world for many decades. Some of the most brutal enforcers were the older women, the office manager, that she was completely identified with the CEOs. She wanted to please them. That was her livelihood depended on that. Everything depended on that. So of course, she was going to be the enforcer. And women with their children, they have a male child. They want him to succeed. They want him to do well in the culture. They're not thinking about how they can change the entire culture and have their son be successful. No, they're just going to make their son be successful in the culture that they have to deal with. Female genital mutilation is mostly done, as you know, by grandmothers who want their daughters to be able to get married, and they can't get married unless they have that horrific mutilation done. And so they're the enforcers of all of this. So when you say sometimes women are worse than men, clearly, it's because we fear the results, the brutality of our lives and our children's lives that will occur when we step out of line. Elisha, who has inspired you the most? What authors, what books helped you the most on your journey? You've obviously read pretty much everything. Can you pick out a couple of authors who just from the heart just really inspired you and gave you the courage and the strength to really continue on your journey, on your way to writing this book?
I mean, obviously, Rand Eisler, I can't even come close to the level of scholarship and erudite authorship of her book. She paved the way, and the way that she was able to compile those narratives, still a classic that is just life altering. Merlin Stone's writing was so beautiful when God was a woman, and you talk more about the mythological and spiritual aspects. He's an author and not really on this topic, but he's a teacher whose school I went to for 4 years. Martin Prechtel teaches about ancient cultures, and while he's not really on the same page, perhaps, about things, his understanding of indigenous cultures, I couldn't approach ancient people and their mindset in the same way without his teachings, because most academics can't really put themselves into the mindset of ancient people, and it was so profoundly different. I mean, we can't understand what they were up to unless that we understand that everything that ancients did was in service to the divine. And so those were
Completely
really important.
different paradigm, a way to live, way to have relationship. That's one of the things we believe here at the Museum of Woman, the women and men who are members. We believe that spirituality is not religion, it's not dogma, it is your way of relating to everything around you. Spirituality for us is relationship.
That's right. Oh, and one more book is David Anthony's The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. That was another huge milestone in this whole conversation. And he is still a real player in this conversation. He just got interviewed on NPR about the Indo-European debate. And to his credit, he was one of Maria Gupta's students. And to his credit, he never hastily tried to distance himself. Maybe as a man, he was a little more protected in his career and didn't need to do that so much. And to this day, he says, yeah, her theories all hold up. Maybe there's a few little dates that could be altered a little bit about the waves of migration, Indo-European migrations, but it still all basically holds up. But his book was such a massive compendium of information about the Kurgan hypothesis, the fact that these steppe nomad invaders essentially completely changed everything about our culture, to the revolution in human life and human experience was so that change from egalitarianism to patriarchy completely overshadows the transition to agriculture. Like, most people think, oh, starting agriculture, that was the biggest transformation of human life, but that was actually not that big a deal. Like, most people kind of went back and forth, or maybe they even said, this farming thing isn't what it's cracked up to be. But the transition to patriarchy was a complete change in everything about the human life. And he really details that in his book. And he also details how for thousands of years, the indigenous hunter-gatherers were living peacefully side by side with the goddess worshiping farmers, which really gives me a lot of ideas about, I'll talk about this later, the fictional account that I'm working on, and trying to imagine these two very different people living side by side peacefully. It just really sparked my imagination.
Your chapter 13 is titled Conclusions and Solutions. Can you give us, Elisha, a couple of examples, just two or three examples of what you see as solutions now for humanity to implement? What can particularly women do right now to further a shift towards a better, more peaceful, more just society?
On a grand scale, the conversation about how to end wars and how to get more women into positions of power who are qualified, those things are a little bit out of the scope of a video and are kind of a dream. But on a more basic everyday level, I think it's important for us to get out of the paradigm of enforced monogamy. Now, I'm all for people choosing monogamy if that's what feels good to them, choosing whatever kind of relationships they want. But to get out of doing it for default reasons, structure relationships a bit more along the lines of co-parenting from the beginning. So most people, they still conflate forever love, which almost never happens, with parenthood. And in my mind,
It's so unrealistic, isn't it? I mean, it just never, almost never pans out the way
almost
we
never
tell
pans
people
out.
it's supposed to.
It's like what a cruel joke. All these Disney movies telling young people that like forever after you live happily ever after, and only 15% or so of couples do. And we don't even know if they're really having good sex or they're just kind of like
Agreeing to get along and be in the structure. Yeah.
in the
Well,
structure. But
the Mosuo don't have that nuclear family. You might, as you say, choose to have a male partner, and you invite him to your room in your mother's house, with whom you live, and you have sex. Perhaps you have a child, and he does not have any rights over that child at all. That child belongs to her and her mother's clan, and he helps to raise the children of his mother's clan, his sister's children, that sort of thing. So it's like the biological father, it's not that men don't matter, of course, it's that knowing who the biological father is really shouldn't matter. He does not own these children. There's no reason why that works.
exactly. And maybe that's not something a lot of people want to hear because we're so inculcated into this forever love thing. But I believe that co-parenting should be the contracted, rather than contracting that you're supposed to have sex with each other for eternity, contract that these are the things that you provide to the children, because children are forever. And that's the main thing that you should be committing to. This is what I agree to provide, is this amount of money, this amount of time, whether you're biologically related to the child or not. Like, let's be co-parents. I mean, it could work out that your brother, like in the old matrilineal model where the mother's brother helped raise your kids, and maybe you don't want to raise kids with your brother, and fair enough, but maybe he could send you checks instead of sending checks to the ex that he hates for her children. So start moving the money and the resources within the mother's family, which is forever. I mean, your uncle is forever. Your father and mother may hate each other in 5 years. And, you know, so going more towards a model of contracted, and you could even have a co-parent be the biological father, as
Uh-huh.
long as you first work out what will happen in the very likely event that you won't be forever lovers, but you will be forever co-parents. So
Right.
focus on the co-parenting and then figure out what you'll do if there are other lovers or you're not lovers anymore, and create family structures like that as a clan of either blood family or a community, extended intentional communities,
Mhm.
buying a big house or a piece of land and choosing to co-parent without the necessity of controlling sexuality, because now we have paternity tests. So even if a condition of a man in order to co-parent would be to be the biological father, you can do that without enforced monogamy or all of the jealousy and mate guarding and kind of contentious stuff that goes along with that.
That's another important point that you make. I was married for 13 years, and I was fairly typical. I was so young, I hadn't learned any of these expanded ideas. I remember marriage being an ownership thing for men,
Mhm.
He owned the rights to my body. No other man had any rights to my body. I did not have the right to have relations with another man because my body apparently was owned by my husband. He owned that sexual privilege. On my part, and this is no better. On my part, it was he's the resource, so I can't let him spend his resources on other women because that takes away from my safety and my life and my prosperity and my security. It's just a terrible, terrible paradigm that we've got ourselves so locked into. And when I speak to people about expanding this paradigm into something else, it's very, as you pointed out just a moment ago, it's very hard for them to hear. We are really locked into this idea of what man, woman, marriage, children is supposed to look like. And anything else is some hippy dippy intentional community that they mock and bunch of crazy pot smoking weirdos. We lived so differently for so many millennia. And yet now this reductive, restrictive paradigm is the only one that people can see. We really need to break out of that.
It is, because what that basically means is we're still locked into transactional sex. I mean,
Yeah.
how is it really different to be a prostitute for a night? Here's some money. I get the rights to your body for a night or for a lifetime. Here's a house and a car and my income is taking care of you in exchange for exclusive rights to you for a lifetime. It's transactional. And there's nothing that's more of a killer to Eros than that. Let's bring back sex just for the sake of sex. What a concept. Just to have sex because it feels good and you have love for the person, you have intimacy, and it's fun.
Right, right. And it has nothing to do with economics or security or necessarily your future. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. It's so weird that that's considered normal, that transactional contracted sex is considered normal.
Right. I have so many women acquaintances who can no longer afford to live in their home. They're living
Mm.
alone. Their husband has left them, or maybe he's died, and now they're living on Social Security, and now they have to figure something new out. I think our economic situation that is really crashing is guiding us towards something that might be really good for us. And that is living more communally. As you said, buying a big house with 4 or 5 bedrooms and having women live together. There's a hotel not very far from here. It's now a DoubleTree, but it's got probably about 200 rooms. And it's got a great downstairs area, common area. It's kind of a lush jungle with a fountain and a little forest and a little river and a great common area to sit and watch TV, kitchen, a dining room. If women could buy a hotel like that, and somebody called it a crone village, elder women who don't want to live alone anymore, maybe they shouldn't live alone anymore, but they're not really ready to give up their own personal space. We could all live in a hotel like that, have our own little room, and then for our privacy and for our alone time, and then go down every day to the common areas for food, entertainment, and socializing. We have to find new ways to structure our home life. What are your thoughts on that?
Definitely. I mean, I'm a big supporter of intentional communities. I'd love to see that being more of a normalized thing, more of a way for people to exist without having to take part in the rat race.
Mm-hmm.
And for women to support each other more and join together more. Part of what we've been conditioned in is this competition of gossiping and tearing other women down and feeling envious of other women's beauty, and especially this divide between older women and younger women. So I would love to see women joining forces more. And the more we understand these dynamics of patriarchy, the more we can deconstruct them in ourselves so that we can understand why we feel envious of other women, why we might have an urge to say something mean behind her back. I mean, that's toxic femininity, right? Which I define toxic femininity as patriarchal conditioning of the feminine. And that would be the Mean Girls thing, like that movie from back in the 80s. And now there's a new movie, Mean Girls. And that's how women kind of keep each other separate, because only by joining together, like bonobo chimp females basically join up to prevent male violence. And so there's a lot less violence and injuries among bonobo chimps than in common chimps, because the females join together. And that's kind of what we need to do. So I love this crone motel idea.
I think we have to find ways to create our own systems of economic security instead of relying on what's happening now, getting a job somewhere where you can be fired. If males control the economic security, then we will always be beholden to them. But if we can create that's why I'm so big on women starting their own businesses on the internet, or crafting, or making things and art and selling them. We have to find ways to step out of the paradigm of the corporate world and being dependent upon that, and creating our own systems of economy so that we can be free, so that we can just be free.
Exactly. When you asked me what was unique in this book that wasn't in my great predecessors, I would say the chapter on sexuality and marriage and monogamy owes a great debt to Sex at Dawn. So that's another book that I owe a great debt to and was a big life changer for me. Sex at Dawn, the authors understood that you can't really understand sexuality unless you understand the dynamics of patriarchy. So they devote an entire quarter of their book to talking about patriarchy and how that affects the dynamics. So they understand that. And it all is connected. The nuclear family, the male-headed family, the male-headed state, and the nuclear family is like the little cell building blocks. And the kind of conditioning we go to, the father knows best conditioning, is what allows for authoritarian states to thrive once we're taught that we need to be submissive to the will of the father. Talking about sex and the role of contractual or enforced monogamy, it just goes together with the whole thing.
That was a very eye-opening book, Sex at Dawn. I loved that book. I read it 2 or 3 times because it was so juicy and interesting.
And funny. So I tried to make the next chapter funny.
Yeah. When we live in a paradigm where the male is the authority, and that's conflated with what masculinity is, what being a man is, then you have these comments from men that they feel emasculated by all of this that we're talking about. And what are your, obviously, I think I know what you're going to say, but share with us your views on why this is not emasculating to men.
The entire word and concept of emasculation needs to be deconstructed.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Because we need to ask ourselves, why is it that there is this concept of emasculate but not effeminate? And that is one of the fallacies of patriarchy, is that you're born a woman, you don't have to do anything to be a woman. Well, you just eventually, bleed, and then you're a woman and not a girl. But in order to become a man, you need to do something. You need to separate yourself from all of that gross femininity and rise above it and dominate it. And that's how you become a man. And so you can easily become emasculated, which means, of course, what are you if you're no longer masculine? You're feminine, which is about the worst thing that you can be. So talk about misogyny.
The ultimate insult, isn't it, to call somebody a girl, or you throw like a girl, or anything related to the female anatomy. You're a pussy.
Exactly.
And we talk about the conflation of attributes to male and female, which then become masculine and feminine. And I defy anyone to describe what femininity is without resorting to tired stereotypes. I am on a complete mission to decouple. I think it's yin and yang. And everybody should have, all humans should have equal access to both sides. Let men be as yin as they want, and some men are going to be a lot more yin than others. Separate those things, and then you kind of do away with that whole idea of what masculine is, because I think it's a wrong teaching, and it's a teaching that's almost everywhere, that almost everyone believes in.
Exactly. Especially, I say this all the time. You could not bring two people together in the same room and have the same ideas about what's masculine and what is feminine. Especially now, as there's this massive pendulum swing against feminism that we're seeing now with the rise of the manosphere and the trad wife movement
Yes.
and the red pill and the incels. And a lot of it is driven by women. The trad wife movement is driven by women. They're all doing product placements, having that be their shtick, that they wear little 50s dresses. And this whole movement, people are just so confidently stating, well, the masculine is about doing and the feminine is about being, or the masculine is about leadership and the feminine is about submission. It's like stating this so confidently. How do you know? Like, to me, masculine is just simply the state of being a man, and feminine is simply the state of being a woman.
Well,
That's
and that's actually what the dictionary says. If you look it up, masculine means of the male, and feminine means of the female.
That's
So
all it is.
yeah,
Because you
yeah,
won't find anything else that's true of all men and all women across all cultures. I
right.
mean, people
Right.
are only thinking of their little culture, and that they think it's like some kind of like deep, eternal, primordial truth, that women are like this and men are like this. But all you have to do is look at other cultures that egalitarian and haven't been as touched by patriarchy to see that that's not the case. And now
And
I
most people don't know anything at all about those cultures, not even that they existed at one time, and certainly not that they exist now, that some exist now. And I think that, Elisha, do you agree that most people are, because of the patriarchal systems, are just trying to survive? And so they look at the world as, what can I do today to function in this system? They don't think in terms of, I'm going to devote my whole life to overturning the system. They have kids to feed, work to get to. They've got to keep a roof over their heads. They got to feed the dog and walk the dog. They've got this whole life is completely focused on just getting through each day. That's how most women I talk to feel about their lives. They don't have any extra room to talk about these larger things, much less do anything about them. So this whole trad wife thing that comes up, these are women who see the structure. Okay, maybe I can make some money being a trad wife, and that's what I need right now. I need money. I need to do OnlyFans so I can make some money so I can pay my rent this month. So we're just trapped. I think that's the hardest thing, is how do you make enough space in your life to break out of the paradigm and still keep feeding yourself, keep a roof over your head, and keep your life going. I'm not expecting any genius answers from either one of us, because I think this is a tough thing to do.
I think so. And I think that my answer to that would be that it's still important to to understand these dynamics and deconstruct them, because they still do a lot of harm. So for example, if a woman's going to choose to forego her career to be dependent upon a man, she needs to understand the dynamics that are likely to be in play. Like, all these trad wives now are ending up abused, domestic abuse, living out of their cars, single moms. What a
Right.
surprise. A guy who wanted a submissive wife is abusive to you now, and now he's tired of you and you're living out of your car. Like, you need to, that is a valid choice if you want to, have the man be the financial worker, and you dedicate your life to your kids. That's a beautiful choice. Not many people can afford it anymore, but
Right.
you do have to understand the potential consequences, and that's understanding the patriarchal dynamics. And I do believe that the more we understand it, the more we can deconstruct it for ourselves, because those things make us suffer. The men suffer so much from not having access to their emotional selves, feeling like they need to suppress their emotions, feeling like they're not worthy of support, of creating support networks and supporting each other. And women suffer so much from feeling like they've never had a history. So just taking the time to read a book and understand that women haven't always been just helpmates, that we have created civilization, been queens, been warriors, been inventors, and all of that has been suppressed by history, can just help us to have more self-confidence to be able to say no to relationships that aren't healthy and be able to choose relationships that are healthy.
Well said. When you deconstruct it, then you can, as you help us do in your fantastic book, you can see what's happening under the surface, like the so-called trad wife. She can see that the bargain she's making is that really what the man in that situation feels is that he has purchased the right to do whatever he wishes with her. And she doesn't actually understand that. She thinks that he's taking care of her. But I would say in 80% of the cases with men, they have this sort of subtle, now they may not admit to it, but they have this sort of subtle idea that if I'm completely taking care of her, I basically have the right to treat her how I want. So when we understand those subtle hidden dynamics, we can say, okay, this is not a really good bargain. This is prostitution. And I'm walking into it blindly, and understanding all these things helps us not walk into it blindly. And it also helps us to, when we are presented with an idea for a different way to live, a different paradigm, maybe a group of women all living together under one big roof, that doesn't seem so shocking anymore. That seems like, oh, okay, women have lived this way and been successful. Everything doesn't depend on getting a man. We can live differently. And that's what we talk about a lot at the museum, the queen teaching, talking about the queen archetype in woman. It's really important to us because that archetype is the one with the vision for how life could be, the clarity to think clearly about what's really happening, and to hold some boundaries. And those are the things that women really, really need now. What are you focused on now, Elisha? What work interests you now? And do we have possibly another book from you in store to look forward to?
Right now, I'm doing a series of YouTube dialogues with men about these topics of masculinity and the manosphere and men's work, and how men can support other men who are struggling in ways that don't involve falling down the pit of the manosphere.
Well, how can we find you on YouTube?
It's Elisha Daeva, the same way that it's spelled on my book, and you can find me on YouTube there and see these really beautiful discussions with men. So that's one of the things I'm doing. And then the next two books in the pipeline are in the same series as Before War. One is about the New World, the Americas, because one of the biggest arguments that I get for why patriarchy had to be universal and inevitable, as opposed to a deflection of history that came through a particular culture or a few cultures, is that there was a lot of patriarchal cultures in the Americas when Columbus came. So that's what most people point to. And now I've seen enormous amounts of evidence, overwhelming amounts of evidence, that Columbus was not the first to make it across. Is not so hard to sail across for people who were, like the Phoenicians and the Minoans were incredible sailors. You could take sailboats that are reproductions of Bronze Age sailboats and just hop on the trade wind, and you end up in the Caribbean.
And we know the Vikings were here, right? I mean,
the Vikings were here, but now there's evidence that the Minoans were here. There's hundreds of Minoan artifacts in Michigan, that the even the Romans, and why not? There's nothing in any way hard to believe about that. And it would make sense that some of these traders were keeping their trade routes secret, and so it wasn't generally known and generally shared. So I'm putting together some of that evidence in order to make the case that, I mean, many other books have been written about that and have made this case, but what I'm adding to that conversation is my hypotheses about which cultures brought patriarchy to which cultures. So which cultures in Mexico and the Pacific Northwest, which were the biggest patriarchal, there's obviously a lot of matrilineal egalitarian cultures in the Americas too, mostly in the Northeast and in the Southeast and in the Southwest, the Pueblo cultures, Hopi and those. So my theories as to who were the ones that came from the old world and influenced both the egalitarian cultures and the patriarchal ones. So how patriarchy came to the Americas, basically.
That sounds fascinating. I look forward to that. That looks really interesting.
So the other book I'm working on, and I want it to be transpersonal, it's basically a fictional account of the origins of patriarchy. Honestly, there's nothing else that I feel so challenged by and excited by of anything I've ever done. In some ways, before war was just the thing I needed to get out so that that would be in the collective in order for me to write this, which to me is the most exciting thing, because imagine we've never seen a matrilineal egalitarian culture on screen. Like maybe the closest thing we've seen is Wonder Woman, that sort of like matriarchal island. But to be able to do the world creation, to imagine what is it like to grow up without sex shaming? What is it like to grow up in a promiscuous, orgiastic culture? We don't have any positive words to describe the things. What is it like? What are your daily struggles when you don't have to worry about money or oppression or domination or war or genocide? So that world creation, and then the perspective of seeing the first warriors on the first horses or the first ridden horses, and how those two cultures came together through colonization and rape to be the progenitors of culture as we know it, and to tell that story of the first generation of the invaders and the indigenous people and what that was like.
That sounds incredibly fascinating. Have you ever written a work of fiction before?
Not really, and that's why I feel so intimidated and challenged, especially given that I know how different the mindset was, and to try to create a tone and a kind of a cadence of speech that sounds believable to me, and how this came across, and to try to create that world in a way we can relate to.
I have often thought and said, fish swimming in water, water, what water? It's we really have no idea what it would feel like to live without patriarchy. We have absolutely no idea what it would feel like, and we can't even begin to imagine it. And I myself have lived in up until just the last, I would say, 20 years when I started to realize some of these things. I, like so many women, have lived a life of existential anxiety every day. I remember when I was 20, all day long, I would think, what's going to happen to me? 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 I was so afraid
Mm.
that I would fail, lose my job, disappoint my boss, or not have any money. I just lived this life of being afraid and nervous and fearful and anxious, and it was so part of my zeitgeist that I wasn't even aware of
Mm-hmm.
the level of anxiety that I was carrying every single day. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how it is for maybe 80% of women. What do you
And
think?
men too. Men are also,
Yes,
have the heavy weight. For them, they feel like they have to be the providers. That's like a
yes,
really heavy thing to bear. They feel like they have to dominate women, or they feel emasculated. And yeah,
right.
we're all living under this heavy cloud.
Yeah. Elisha, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your decades of study and research, observation, and work to give this great gift to the world. We just bless everything you do. for humanity. You can get Elisha's amazing book, Before War, on Amazon, wherever you buy books, and you can see her and her fascinating interviews on YouTube at Elisha Daeva, ELISHA Daeva. Wonderful, wonderful. Elisha, thank you. Thank you for all the work, all the insights, all the beauty, and the expansion for all of us. Thank you.
And thank you, Ava, for your work with the Museum of Woman that you've been doing your whole community for so long to raise us up and get this information out there. Thank you so much for your work.